Before it was known as Haiti, the French colony Saint-Domingue was an outpost for pirates. At first, the French settlers made a living selling leather and boucan, or smoked beef. However, as supply ran low, they decided to make the pirates steal from Spanish ships, which held mined silver. The French convinced them to give up their pirate ways and allow them to settle on the land, and using their treasure money, they bought sugar plantations. Haiti was France's richest outside colony. Sugar is a labor-intensive crop which required many hands to do the job. By the late 18th century, more than 40,000 slaves were being imported to the island, and by the 19th century, slaves made up almost 90% of the population. There were 4 main social classes on the island at the time, and each had a problem with the other. At the top were the free white people, or the Grand Blancs, and they were angry about French trade laws. Underneath them were free colored people, or the gens de couleur libres, who suffered legal discrimination and did not have all the rights that rich whites had. They had to enlist in the army called the Maréchaussée when they reached manhood for a 3-year term, and in it they would capture fugitive slaves, protect the people, and sometimes collect taxes. After 3 years, they would have to serve on the militia without pay, and they couldn't hold office and were basically excluded from Haitian society. Underneath them were the poor whites, or the Petit Blancs, and they were angry that people of color had more privilege than them. And at the bottom of the social classes were the slaves, who suffered through terrible conditions and wanted change.
Slaves began to hear rumors that France was granting them freedom with the passing of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Slave owners were scared of how this would affect them and their business. Meanwhile, the Petit Blancs were angry that the rich people of color were not being discriminated enough. The Petit Blancs thought that just because they were not wealthy enough to own slaves, they were being oppressed, so that they hoped for independence from France in order to institute a democracy and have everyone's voice be heard. They were fueled by the idea of the Third Estate asking for full representation among the clergy and nobles. The governor of Haiti, Montucho, wanted to slow down the ideas of French Revolution and give France time to think about their policy on slavery. The French Revolution grew, and in May of 1791, the National Assembly granted full French citizenship to free men of color. This angered the Petit Blancs, and fighting broke out between them and the free people of color. In August of 1791, the slaves joined in, and a massive slave revolt broke out.
The leader of the revolt, Toussaint Louverture, a former well-educated slave, helped the slaves form an army that could withstand French troops, especially focusing on guerrilla warfare. He sent a letter to all slaves, introducing himself as their leader and explaining that he was fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity. He displayed an impressive talent for designing and leading military strategies and tactics that would enable him to make the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue one of the most successful in history. When America heard of the slave revolt breaking out, they rushed to the aid of the whites on the island. Thomas Jefferson was split on the issue because he was a slave owner himself, but he believed in many of the ideas of the French Revolution, so he compromised on giving limited aid to suppress the slave revolt. Louverture became a Spanish military officer since the Spanish supported the slave revolts and since they were hoping to weaken France. The British invaded Saint-Domingue in October of 1793, and the French decided to free the slaves because they could not fight the British, Spanish, and the slaves all at once. On February 4, 1794, the National Convention ratified the freedom of the slaves. After hearing of the freeing of the slaves, Toussaint Louverture returned his allegiance to France.
Just because slavery was abolished does not mean that the sugar plantation system was, since it made a lot of money for the island and France. Louverture and André Rigaud, a military leader favored by the French, disagreed on Rigaud's want for control of a southern state on the island. This led to a civil war where Louverture and his lieutenant Jacques Dessalines fought against Rigaud for 13 months and won.
Saint-Domingue was technically still part of France and under Napoleon's rule. By 1801, Napoleon had thought that this revolution had been going on for too long and sent his brother-in-law, Charles Victor Emmanuel Leclerc, to arrest Louverture and fight against the slave revolt. Despite the French's superior technology and weaponry, they could not win against the guerrilla warfare, mainly due to the spread of disease, which killed thousands of French soldiers, including Leclerc. The fighting continued, and Napoleon finally withdrew his troops in November of 1803, when the slaves managed to beat the greatest European military power at the time. Haiti declared its independence on January 1, 1804, and used the expression "live free or die" in their proclamation.
This revolution resulted in the first successful slave revolt and first country in Latin America to gain independence, second after America. The unfair treatment of the slaves sped up the progress of the revolution, and since the treatment was so bad, it caused the most violent and successful slave revolt in history. The French Revolution inspired the revolution that occurred in Haiti and helped spread the ideas to the island.